So let's do it. Here's part 2 of the Cold War Oversimplified. Well, part 2 reacting to part 1. So that's confusing.
Oh, wait, inevitable. He said it was inevitable. Hey, you know who I haven't checked in on in a while? My good friend China. Whoa, what happened to you? What happened to them was a full-blown civil war that had been going on since 1927. The People's Liberation Army, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, successfully defeated the Republic of China, who fled to Taiwan. The now communist China and the Soviet Union signed a mutual defense treaty. This was terrible news for the West. But wait, there's more. After the Second World War, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel. In the north,
This makes me so mad. I hate listening to Americans talk about the history of Korea. Korea was divided along the 38th parallel. By who? Who divided Korea along the 38th parallel? Because Korea wasn't going to be divided. The DPRK was going to be the entire country. They were going to be a united socialist state. But the U.S. did everything they could to back fascist right-wing forces in Korea. And then when the DPRK was destroying the U.S.'s forces and the U.S.-backed leader because nobody wanted to fight for them, there was a voting plan devised at the UN to divide the country in half. And that line, the 38th parallel as it's called, was drawn in a National Geographic map by two higher-ups in the Pentagon who had no knowledge of Korea. They just, picked a line that looked somewhere in the middle. And that's what became South Korea after the U.S. installed a fascist dictatorship. But even after that line was drawn, the North, swept through with the help of the Soviets then, and the Chinese, and almost liberated the entire peninsula. And that's when the U.S. started their bombing raids and started their bombing campaigns, and that's when they killed 20% of the Korean population and leveled every building over 1 story tall, after the whole peninsula was almost liberated. And then they installed Syngman Rhee as dictator, this fascist who came out of the U.S. universities, or it was like Oxford or someone, I don't know. He was trained up, from the start to be a U.S. puppet leader in Korea. So that's the real story. Let's see how it's described here.
the Soviets set up a communist regime. In the South, America set up an anti-communist regime. Both were led by very sweet-looking old men, but don't let that deceive you. They were both ruthless dictators, and both dreamed of reuniting Korea under their own regime. Now that he had the bomb, Stalin was feeling a little more cocky.
Everyone thought Korea was going to be reunited. Everyone thought the 38th parallel was just a temporary thing. Because nobody could imagine a divided Korea. And the U.S. just dropped bombs on the North until they didn't have any targets left to bomb. And U.S. fighter pilots were literally defecting out of the U.S. Army or switching sides. And then they decided to just try and set up a government in South Korea and have been trying to topple the North through more covert means ever since. And I love how they don't mention the U.S. involvement at all. Like, I'm sure they're going to say that the U.S. came in during the Korean War after the North invaded the South. But they don't even mention that Syngman Rhee was a U.S.-backed dictator. Or that nobody wanted to fight for Syngman Rhee because he had no actual support on the ground among working-class Koreans, that they all supported Kim Il-sung and the DPRK. Or I wonder if they're going to talk about all the ways that the U.S. artificially propped up South Korea and dumped money into them, after doing this, as they were sanctioning the North, keeping the North under the most stringent economic sanction regime in the entire world outside of Cuba. They're not going to talk about any of it. They just say Korea was divided along the 38th parallel. They don't even try and come up with some propaganda reason for how. Who divided them along the 38th parallel? Who was backing this anti-communist regime in South Korea that had almost no grassroots support? It was the U.S. State Department.
And he finally gave Kim permission to attack. The North launched a
He gave Kim permission to attack. He gave Kim permission to liberate his own country from the U.S.-backed fascists. Nobody needed to give the Koreans permission to do that. Their people were already doing that themselves. And that's why the U.S. had to kill 20% of their population to knock them back. But even still, they've held on to at least half of their sovereignty, as the U.S. has occupied half their country, which is really what South Korea is. It's occupied Korea.
Surprise invasion of the South on June 25, 1950. With Soviet aid, the North Koreans steamrolled through, taking Seoul in just 3 days and replacing one ruthless dictator with another. The UN were freaking out and quickly created an emergency force made up of troops from 16 countries to defend the South. The West still held Busan and made landings at Incheon near Seoul. They pushed the North Koreans out of Seoul, replacing the ruthless dictator that had replaced the first ruthless dictator with the same ruthless dictator that had previously been replaced by the new ruthless dictator. And the West then continued all the way up the Korean Peninsula. At this point, China was getting worried that the UN may just keep going. The US had sent this guy to lead the operation. After winning the Pacific theater of World War II, General Douglas MacArthur's head was big, and his balls were bigger. He reassured President Truman that there was absolutely no way at all that the Chinese would ever get involved. Meanwhile, 500,000 Chinese troops were crossing into Korea. Nuke 'em. No. Nuke 'em. No. Ah, come on. You're fired. The US considered the nuclear option, but now that the Soviets also had the bomb, they didn't want to risk all-out global destruction.
But they would have. If the U.S. wasn't threatened by nuclear weapons, they literally would have annihilated the peninsula of Korea with a nuke. Like, does that not make you question this narrative where you're portraying the U.S. as the good guys in the Cold War? The fact that they would have nuked Korea if the Soviets didn't have nukes? And then, we talk about denuclearization today and how Korea is such a horrible threat because they have nukes. And we need to continue to attack Korea because they have nukes. Why the hell would North Korea give up their nukes? Literally, we said if they gave up their nuke, or if they didn't have nukes earlier, we would have blown up the entire peninsula of Korea with an atomic weapon. But we didn't because they had nukes too. So why would they give them up? John Bolton said on the news once, we're going to follow the Libya model with North Korea. We're going to get them to give up their weapons so we can follow the Libya model. Muammar Gaddafi gave up his weapons in Libya, and then the U.S. invaded him and killed him and destroyed his country. Turned it from one of the wealthiest and most prosperous countries in Africa to a country with an open-air slave trade. And he said that's the model that they're going to follow for Korea once we get them to give up their nukes. Why would they trust the U.S.? And how are we the good guys in this situation? How are China the bad guys for coming to the aid of these people who had 20% of their population massacred by U.S. bombs? And then once, China joins to help Korea maintain their independence, or at least their independence on half the peninsula, the U.S. says, nuke them? Or there are higher-ups in the U.S. military calling to nuke them? But we're the good guys. We're the good guys. Don't forget it.
The communists pushed the West right back almost to the exact same spot they had all started from, and they ended up in a stalemate where they remained until both sides finally agreed to work towards a peace settlement in 2018. Back in America, Americans decided they wanted a new president who would be tough on communism, so they elected famed World War II General Eisenhower, who was really hard to draw.
You mean the American oligarchs backed and propped up a candidate who would be tough on communism to combat FDR, who in many ways was forced to capitulate to the communists, or at least the labor movement, because there were 1 million card-carrying communists in the U.S. at the time, and the largest number of wildcat strikes in history in the U.S. in the 40s, because the unions were afraid that they were going to lose the jobs and the benefits that they had gotten during the war. Because the war created a lot of government jobs or state jobs that they thought were going to go away, afterwards, manufacturing jobs and stuff like that. But, and people were afraid to lose those because guess what? The free market doesn't actually work better, and the government intervening made the U.S. economy stronger and better for workers. So that triggered all these wildcat strikes, and FDR implemented a lot of social reforms that he's given credit for. He's considered sometimes a social democrat or the most pro-labor leftist president in U.S. history. But he was forced to do these things, via class struggle. Via the class struggle of the communists, or the ideological struggle of the communists in the U.S. They were forced to by the Soviet Union because they didn't want to have a more depleted and more poor workforce than the socialists. They wanted to, pretend like capitalism was a superior system for a while. So, the government was forced to do a lot of things for workers, and a lot of the things implemented by FDR have been dismantled as capitalism has continued and continued to develop into a higher stage. But, yeah, that's what the American oligarchs and lobbyists and donors were trying to combat at the end of FDR's time as president.
It's 1953. Hey, Stalin, how you doing? Oh, he's dead. He had a cerebral hemorrhage, and his reign of terror kinda came back to bite him in the ass, because he had imprisoned all of his best doctors, and those that were left were too terrified to treat him.
That is one of the stupidest fucking things I've ever heard in my life. Dude, these people literally think the world's a comic book. So he was this horrible dictator, and everybody just listened to what he said while he was alive. But then, when he got sick, everyone just said, never mind, we're not going to listen to that guy anymore and let him die. And the doctors refused to treat him. How is he getting everybody in the country to listen to him when he was alive then? So was it only the KGB and the army and the armed people who would listen to him? So they were just his foot soldiers? But all the doctors and all the normal people didn't listen to him? Nobody in the army turned on him as he was being this ruthless dictator who purposefully starved people for fun? Like, in what world could this be real? Could you have the leader of a country who can't find a doctor because every doctor in the country refuses to treat him? Like, you gotta be brain dead if you are a fully grown adult and you hear this and you're like, seems legit. Like, this is the kind of thing like my friends' dads would tell me about communism. Like, oh, you're a communist, are you, Smith? Well, did you know that Stalin's doctors wouldn't treat him when he died because he was such a big bad dictator? I'm like, oh, really? Okay, well, they abolished illiteracy and massively increased life expectancy and, brought education to children, massively decreased malnutrition, defeated the Nazis. And I'm like, so that sounds really crazy about the doctor, but, all this other stuff, that's something we should take into account too. You're just, like, arguing with facts and material analysis against just the dumbest propaganda you could ever think of.
The new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, called a meeting and said, hey guys, you know how Stalin was imprisoning and murdering us all for doing basically nothing? Yeah, he was kind of a jerk. I'm really not sure how this is news to you. Khrushchev went on a campaign of de-Stalinization. Statues of Stalin were taken down, Stalingrad was renamed, and Khrushchev announced that he wanted the Soviet people to be happy and would allow greater freedom in the Soviet Union.
And this is why we don't like Khrushchev, folks. Just kidding. We should defend Khrushchev against imperialist lies, because the Soviet Union was still, much better than the capitalist countries at this time, much better. But yeah, he gave the imperialists a lot of ammo, and he gave them a foothold within the Soviet Union as well, economically, including ideologically and economically.
So how did that work out? Well, an uprising in East Germany was brutally suppressed, a revolution in Hungary was brutally suppressed, and demonstrations in Poland were brutally suppressed.
So remember when we were talking about the U.S. attempted color revolutions? And we said the U.S. backs a bunch of violent extremist separatists to try and incite riots and what they call color revolutions, which are really just U.S.-backed coups. But then when socialist governments, who are prepared for imperialist attempts to overthrow their countries, when socialist governments combat these color revolutions, and the authorities of socialist governments shut down these color revolutions, these U.S.-backed coup attempts, separatism attempts, the U.S. media claims that it's horrible suppression, and the government killed people without reason, and these were all peaceful protests, and the communist government couldn't tolerate any peaceful protests, so they just came in and gunned everyone down. So even if the U.S. color revolution fails after they dump millions of dollars of our tax money into various NGOs or use USAID to funnel money into these color revolution extremist separatist groups who are almost always extremely far right, even if those efforts to overthrow the government don't work out 100%, the U.S. can still use it as propaganda and say, oh, the Soviet Union suppressed our attempt to overthrow them, or Hungary or East Germany. The government suppressed our efforts to overthrow them. How horrible and dictatorial they are. You know, they just massacre their civilians for fun. I saw a bunch of police in East Germany kicking puppies off a bridge. The horrors of communism.
Although he did finally allow some mild reforms. Back in the Soviet Union, he permitted more cultural expression, but then began banning stuff based on his own personal taste. Modern art looks like a child urinated on a canvas. Banned. Jazz music sounds like the feeling of needing to fart. Banned. Your poetry is really depressing. How could anyone in the Soviet Union be depressed? You're banned. Khrushchev wanted the Soviet people to be happy, but not like that, or that, or that.
I mean, I don't know. I'm assuming it wasn't like that, but they did want, artistically, they wanted more realism, Soviet realism, as opposed to abstract art. And a big reason for that is because the CIA was actually backing like a bunch of like abstract artists. It's really weird. Look up the Congress for Cultural Freedom if you haven't ever. But they were funneling a bunch of money into like Jackson Pollock and artists like that, sort of artistic expression. Yeah, kind of crazy. And I guess the Soviet Union was trying to combat that with Soviet realism. Oh, thank you for subscribing. Oh, that was on YouTube. Sweet.
Young people began enjoying abhorrent Western pop culture. Son, remove that disgusting imperialist apparel at once. Shut up, Dad. You can't tell me what to do. Well, would you look at that? Turns out he can tell me what to do. The West had initially liked the cut of Khrushchev's jib, but world events soon soured relations even more. The two sides were spying on each other a whole lot throughout the Cold War. The KGB had spies and informants in nearly every aspect of Western life and government, so much so that whenever the US tried to send spies into the Soviet Union, the KGB were usually ready to arrest them on the spot. Members of the Manhattan Project aided the Soviet Union in acquiring the bomb. Some American officials believed they were on the wrong side. I'll sell you 3 secrets for $5 million. Okay, go ahead. The Allies...
And I like how these guys are still considered terrible. You know, the people from the Manhattan Project who let the Soviet Union develop nuclear weapons, look, they're portraying them as just corrupt. Oh, they just wanted money from the Soviets. You literally admitted earlier in the video that if the Soviets didn't have nuclear capabilities, they were going to nuke the peninsula of Korea. And we talked about how, you know, countries who are opposed to the US's world domination, having nuclear weapons is preferable to them not, so the U.S. doesn't have free reign to just nuke them, which they've shown in Japan that they will do, and which you said in this video that they were prepared to do to Korea, but they were scared of retaliation. But the people who gave those folks in the East the ability to retaliate, the ability to protect themselves from nuclear annihilation, those people are evil and corrupt? No, you're just mad. You're evil and corrupt, and you're mad that they wouldn't let you nuke any more civilians.
Allies are digging a tunnel under East Berlin to tap your communications. There's an American agent living at this address in Moscow, and sometimes, when I'm home alone, I like to put on my wife's dresses, sit in the corner, and cry for hours. Very interesting. In America, fear took hold during the Red Scare and the McCarthy trials. American values imploded as fear of communism collided with freedom of thought and expression, and communist kind of became a buzzword thrown around to describe anything people didn't like. Hollywood? Communist. Your next door neighbor's dog? Communist. When the grocery store cashier asks if you need a bag when you clearly can't carry 10 tubs of Baconaise in your hands? Communist.
Again, this is just the American ruling class. This is just McCarthyism and the intelligence agencies enforcing this on everyone else and blackballing everyone in communism. And you say that fear of communism started to clash with freedom of expression? It's not a clash. It's freedom of expression being shit on. Because there's no freedom of expression under capitalism. Because the capitalists are always going to do stuff like McCarthyism. And Operation Condor in Latin America, where the U.S. was giving their preferred Latin American dictators kill lists and training them up in torture techniques so they could torture and kill anybody with a left-wing ideology. Like, this is what's been done in, you know, North and South America for the past however many years now, during the entirety of the Cold War. There's no freedom of expression here. You know, that's just something that was written down on a piece of paper a long time ago.
But one area in particular where the US had an edge over the Soviet Union was in its espionage technology. In particular, U-2 spy planes flew across Russia carrying out surveillance from the skies. There was a nasty incident in 1960 though, when one was shot down and Khrushchev was furious. Who the hell is this? He's a high-altitude weather enthusiast who flew off course. Okay, that sounds plausible. Wait a minute. Why does he have a gun and a poison needle? Because he's a very naughty high-altitude weather enthusiast. But much to America's concern, the Soviet Union appeared to be ahead in the space race. Everyone freaked out when Russia launched the world's first satellite, and then they actually sent a man into space. Even worse, there also appeared to...
They just throw in, like, random horrific stuff the US did. Like, oh yeah, by the way, they tried to assassinate Khrushchev. It's like, well, if the Soviets would have tried to assassinate a US president, it probably would have started nuclear war. You know, but when we do it to them, it's just like a little comical bit in this this Cold War oversimplified video. Like, oh yeah, we did some bad stuff too. Like when we said we were going to nuke the peninsula of Korea after our fascist dictatorship failed to take over the whole peninsula. Oopsies.
Be a missile gap in the Soviets' favor, and Khrushchev was so confident that he even allowed the US to set up a technology exhibit in Moscow, attended by a certain Vice President Richard Nixon. Check this out. We have color TV. Yes, but we've been to space and can obliterate you with our massive nuclear arsenal. Check out this vegetable peeler. Tensions increased further when both sides upgraded their atomic bombs to hydrogen bombs, and after West Germany was allowed to join NATO in 1955, Khrushchev set up the Defensive Warsaw Pact, strengthening the military ties between the Soviet Union and its satellite states. In 1960, Americans decided they wanted a new president who would be tough on communism, so they elected John F. Kennedy. The Soviet Union was advancing its technology, but it was also bleeding its coffers dry, and all of the money was going towards the military, not the people. Life under communism was still as hard as ever, and Berlin remained a thorn in the Soviet side. The contrast between the economically prosperous West and the struggling East was clearer day by day, and East Berliners were still able to freely travel to the West. Now, many of them were deciding to stay there. Millions defected to West Germany via West Berlin, causing Eastern factories to lose workers and taking a heavy toll on the economy. Soviet leaders decided this couldn't continue any longer.
And we've talked about the way that the US does this in countries like Colombia or Honduras or South Korea. Anywhere where they, have a very close ally or a place where a bunch of US military bases are set up. They're basically occupying. Which fits the description for Honduras, Colombia, and South Korea. And obviously the governments in these places are all very right-wing and pro-US for the most part. But in places like that, they will bribe the skilled workers. They'll bribe people to defect. And South Korea has basically become an industry. Loyal Citizens of Pyongyang really is a great movie that exposes the South Korea defector agency and how these defectors are treated, after the government uses them for their own nefarious purposes. To try and foment regime change against the home country. But they'll, like in Venezuela, a lot of what they've done is bribe the skilled workers. So anybody with like engineering skills, they'll, pay them to defect or whatever, offer them a job in the West to try and, just part of the campaign to starve these countries out as they're sanctioning the crap out of these countries. So, and obviously we've debunked the lie on this stream before that West Germany was just doing so much better than East Germany and everybody just wanted to defect so bad. But there were defectors, and I'm sure some people just thought capitalism was a lot better, bought into the propaganda. But there was also, intelligence agencies and NGOs and whoever else trying to attack these socialist countries by getting skilled workers to defect. Or any workers to defect, really.
First, Khrushchev tried this. Leave West Berlin, or else. Or else what? Or else I'll be really mad at you. Yeah, no, we're gonna stay. Listen, man, West Berlin is ours, East Berlin is yours. That's just how it is. Kennedy felt pretty good about his show of American resolve. But wait a second, did you catch that? Let's replay it.
East Berlin is...
Why does Kennedy look like that? They make him look like a serial killer. You deranged psycho. Look at him. He's like,
Uh-oh, Kennedy just told Khrushchev that the USA wouldn't interfere in what the Soviets did with their section of Berlin, so Khrushchev came up with a new idea. We're gonna build a wall, and it's gonna be a big, beautiful wall, and it's gonna keep out all the Mexicans. This wall's gonna keep in these Berliners. Oh, sorry, it's gonna keep in all the Mexicans. On August 13th, 1961, Berliners woke up to find their city divided into two, with barbed wire and guards blocking the border between east and west. Over time, a wall was constructed throughout the city. Families were torn apart. Thousands would risk their lives escaping over the wall, and hundreds would die.
That's definitely what do they even mean? I mean, maybe you could have extended families torn apart if they happened to live in the same city on opposite sides, but that's not even true. You know, they let people go over, and they were purposefully, or as they were saying before the wall was built, you could freely go over, you know, and before they built it, people knew they were going to build it, and they would have let them go over. Maybe that's impractical, you know, if their house is on one side, I get that, but even still, you know, you're being separated from your extended family. It's not like, you know, sons and daughters were on this side, and moms and dads were on this side. And then they just started building a wall really fast, and they're like, oh no, mom and dad. You know, now I'm going to be separated from you forever. These people, like, built this wall at light speed so fast we couldn't get to the other side before they finished building it. No, you know, the horrible construction of communism. Did you know that China built a wall called the Great Wall to defend against imperialists and colonizers? That's evil too.
Trying. To the despair of Berliners, the West were unable to do anything about it, but the wall did put on full display the failure of the communist system. As Kennedy said, democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in. As part of the agreement between the two sides, U.S. diplomats were still allowed to travel to East Berlin, but suddenly, East Berlin crossing guards started giving them the business, and Kennedy was like, nah. In October, the U.S. rolled tanks up to the crossing point at Checkpoint Charlie as a show of...
What a great guy. And as people in the chat are pointing out, in East Germany, this wall was called the Anti-Fascist Wall, saying it was going to defend from the U.S.'s attempts to destabilize and overthrow the Republic, or the Socialist Republic of East Germany, or the socialist countries. But the way this video is portraying it is, oh, Kennedy was such a good guy, and he wanted to help the people of East Germany so much that he rolled tanks up to their border. Like, this looks a lot like imperialism to me. U.S. tanks rolling into the part of Germany that they've been occupying and threatening to break down the border of East Germany, this sovereign socialist republic. You know, look at this image right here. Which side is imperialistic here? We're supposed to believe that this is the evil side because they built a wall. You know, but this side that's bringing the tanks to threaten to destroy this side, they're the good guys. Well, they built the wall. We had to bring our tanks in and destroy it. That's not imperialism. We're doing it for human rights. Kennedy's such a good dude.
Strength. The Soviets did the same, and the two were in a standoff. They stayed like that for 16 hours, and the world braced for nuclear Armageddon. Thankfully, though, Kennedy called Khrushchev directly and was like, hey man, this is getting way too hot. How about you back your tanks up by an inch and we'll do the same? Sounds good. Okay, how about you back your tanks up by another inch and we'll follow suit? Alright, hey, you want to do another inch? And they both very slowly inched away from the apocalypse. Phew, let's hope that's the biggest crisis of my presidency. It wasn't.
I'm sure they're talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we'll get to eventually. I'm sure we'll watch part 2 of the Cold War Oversimplified.